Preliminary matter is I must ask whether any member knows of any known conflict of interest or appearance of conflict with respect to matters before the Environmental Management Commission's Groundwater and Waste Management Committee. If any member knows of a conflict of interest or appearance of conflict, please so state at this time. Hearing and seeing none, we'll go on to the next item on the agenda, which is approval of the meeting summary from January 11, 2023. Has everyone had a chance to review it? Do I have a motion to approve?
I motion to approve.
Commissioner Anderson moves to approve. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Commissioner Weiss has seconded the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
It passes. Thank you. This meeting, we do not have any action items. So we're going to move on to our informational items, which is part 2 of our basic course on groundwater and waste management. So I thank Director Scott for putting this presentation together for us today, especially with all these difficulties.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Chair Bailey, members of the committee, Michael Scott, Director of the Division of Waste Management. Appreciate all the support our team put forth in order to provide this overview to the committee. Got a lot of the team members with us here today, so we'll hit it at a high level and we can take the questions and answers into the granular details if needed. I do want to thank the DIT staff and DEQ staff who really worked diligently on the room updates here to the ground floor hearing room. A lot of new equipment and hopefully everybody online can hear us well. So I know a lot of work on that front. So today we're going to touch on the Division of Waste Management overview of assessment and remediation of sites. And what we also want to do is touch on the current remaining list of groundwater interim maximum allowable concentration compounds and how we are working with those IMACs across our different programs in order to help inform this committee of their continued use and also the potential path forward for those remaining IMACs. So as we stated in the last committee meeting, our Division of Waste Management's mission is to prevent harmful releases of waste to the environment and clean up existing contamination when it does occur or when we find out about it. This series of photos shows a pre-regulatory landfill up in the Wake Forest community in North Carolina where that waste was discovered, ultimately removed, a source removal type remedial action, the area revegetated and put back into a proper stormwater conveyance. We are comprised as a division of 5 key program sections from hazardous waste, solid waste, Superfund, underground storage tanks, and the brownfields redevelopment section, our newest section in waste management. We're really excited about that. So just touching on a few of the key items from our last overview that we provided in the committee meeting. A little bit on our organizational structure, as far as our great deputy, Julie Woosley, and our 5 section chiefs, who all of them are here with us today. Like I said, we're prepared to stay at a high level or get really granular on questions with remediation, assessment, and use of IMACs. So I appreciate the whole team being here. Yes.
Could you ask them to stand up?
Be glad to. So I'll start left to right. Bruce Nicholson, the section chief of our Brownfields redevelopment section. Thank you, Bruce. So Brownfields is unique. They're statutorily based. There's no administrative code or rules for that program. So, but we have a lot of interest in it and a growing program to say the least. The next program is hazardous waste. Adam Ulishny is our section chief. Adam. Thank you for coming, Adam. Solid waste, Ed Musler. Superfunds, Bill Heineke. And UST, Vance Jackson. Thanks, Vance. And some of our branch heads are also with us today. Everybody kind of put forth a collective effort to provide this assessment remediation overview for the committee.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Bailey. So today we're going to touch on our overview of regulations and requirements for remediation and assessment. When we do find that contaminants may have entered the environment or we know they enter the environment in North Carolina, at waste management sites, what we do to assess those levels, meaning determine the levels of these contaminants in the environment, what we compare them to in order to lead to next steps like remediation. I believe Chair Smith touched on this in the last committee meeting, a little bit of information on how we prioritize and rank sites. There's a lot of sites in North Carolina that we're working on. There's a lot of sites that need attention. So how we rank them, determine their associated risk is an important part of this conversation. And also the types of sites and assessment or remediation that may be using a current IMAC. So we do, Chair Bailey, want to dovetail in some of these compounds, ones that we are still looking at on sites that are in assessment and remedial action, and maybe a few that we're not seeing that may inform the committee on next steps regarding that remaining list. And also potential impacts if the groundwater interim maximum allowable concentrations were eliminated and we default to the practical quantitative limits. So just the key areas we want to touch on today. So a little bit of background, a lot of you are familiar with this, but a lot of what we do on the assessment remediation front is really anchored to groundwater and surface water protection and rules that come through this particular committee and commission, but also the applicable general statutes. So I won't read all of this, but it gives you the framework, the foundation when we start assessment and remedial action at a site, the North Carolina statutes, and also the applicable rules that this commission has purview over in order to facilitate either assessment or remedial action. And you see there what you're familiar with, the 2B surface water standards, 2C well construction standards, 2L groundwater rules, and also sedimentation pieces. Additional specific state regulations are further touched on in this presentation. We're not saying we've hit every applicable rule, but we've tried to give you a good background on how we approach these key topics when it comes to the world of waste management. So as I mentioned, we do plan to touch on interim maximum allowable concentrations in groundwater. I know that's been a this committee. We talk about it in the context a lot of remediation, not so much in the world of permitting. But our division, as the Division of Water Resources has noted, has requested that the majority of the remaining IMACs be established in the past for the purpose of cleaning up, remediating sites, many times as a result of a property transaction or an environmental site assessment where it was sought out from our division in coordination with the Division of Water Resources. Could an interim maximum allowable concentration in groundwater be calculated as a target value to clean up that particular site? What's important, that IMAC level is interim, but it's also protective of public health and the environment. It's important to note the second bullet, the IMAC was generally higher than the applicable standard at the time, which would have likely have been the practical quantitative limit. And that's the rule reference as we talk a lot in this committee about IMACs, how practical quantitative limits are referenced. They're in the O2L, O2, O2C rules. We do not generally develop IMACs as part of a facility permitting process. IMACs are more so used by our division, and when we have requested them, they're part of a remediation or a cleanup effort. So our first program we're going to touch on is the hazardous waste program, and you met Adam, our section chief that's with us here this morning. The regulations are anchored in General Statute 130A, Article 9. There's pieces of that related to risk-based environmental remediation of sites, and more specifically, the rules that recently came before this body, the North Carolina 13A Administrative Code, which went through the rule readoption process, which also incorporates the federal Code of Federal Regulations 264 and 265 by reference. What we would want you to know is these regulations are applicable to hazardous waste, RCRA facility assessment, which includes identifying areas of potential contamination at a site, then proceeding to a facility investigation where you're defining that lateral and vertical extent of all contamination in all media, whether it's groundwater, surface water, soil at a site, looking at corrective measures, you're evaluating remediation options for each area at a site, and then reaching a decision on the implementation or path forward. what remedy do you want to incorporate? Are you going to pump groundwater out and treat it before discharging it? Are you going to remove contaminated soil? You know, what type of remedy would return that site or that environment to the applicable standard? And these events often occur in multiple stages and often at numerous separate areas at a single site. We work on sites that are several thousand acres. We work on sites that are a quarter of an acre. So a lot of this is a phased approach. So when we look at methods for site prioritization, once again, this was a question from the last committee or an item for us to at least touch on. And with the hazardous waste permitted sites, they're prioritized equally. That's an important comment here. The permit related to these sites dictates the corrective action and the remediation requirements, how they're going to address contamination that's been found at the site and has entered the environment for each part of contamination at that site. The initial focus is always on receptors, whether they're on-site or off-site. Water supply wells, that's one of our key pieces. If there's contaminants in the environment, we don't want those contaminants entering a drinking water source. So how are we going to protect that drinking water source, filter that drinking water source, or remove contaminants so they don't impact what we would call that receptor? We're also looking at the potential, as we've discussed in this committee, for vapor intrusion, where we have contaminated groundwater, contaminated soil, and vapors that could produce an indoor air environment that's not protective. And we're screening soils against other reference values, which we call preliminary soil remediation goals, to see if that soil is protective with dermal contact, meaning skin contact, or if levels of contaminants in soil could impact the underlying groundwater. These sites, hazardous waste, are required to clean up to the North Carolina groundwater standards that this commission and committee have purview over. If there's not a groundwater standard, then we look at an interim maximum allowable concentration, IMAC. If there is no IMAC, then the Analytical Laboratories Practical Quantitation Limit, or that acronym PQL, is then referenced where applicable. And they also obviously incorporating the O2B surface water standards, and then also the soil screening levels, which we have touched on. So as we go a little further, we did want to try to characterize, as we're working on hazardous waste sites where contaminants may have entered the environment, you know, where do we reference these interim groundwater levels that this Groundwater and Waste Management Committee has worked on here for several years? The permitted sites utilize the remaining IMAC standards to determine if a detected remaining IMAC constituent needs to be added to the list of chemicals of concern in their hazardous waste permit. They are required to analyze groundwater for the remaining IMAC constituents you see listed there based on the Code of Federal Regulations and Appendix 9. If they are detected, they're required to remediate to that O2L interim maximum allowable concentration for groundwater. And so we've given you the four dibenzofuran, dibromomethane, the PCBs, and vinyl acetate that will be applicable to this particular reference. They're also required to analyze groundwater for volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds. And the remaining below IMAC constituents are typically included in analytical reports. And if they're detected, they're required to be remediated to that applicable IMAC standard. And you can see the list there. I won't read through them all. But the effort here, as we touch on each program, is to also tie our assessment and remediation work at Waste Management back to this list of interim maximum allowable concentrations, hoping to inform this committee what are the options for these compounds moving forward. As Chair Bailey has noted, there's the option to keep them as an interim standard, to delete them, default to the PQL, or to put them out for public comment if the committee's decision point is that for full adoption into O2L. So if the IMACs were eliminated, as we briefly stated already, permitted sites with their hazardous waste permit would utilize that lab practical quantitation limit, PQL, instead of any remaining IMAC standards. If they were eliminated, to determine if a detected remaining IMAC constituent needs to be added to the list of chemicals of concern in their permit. And they are required to analyze groundwater for those 4, as you see here in the second bullet, based on the Appendix 9 that's listed in the Code of Federal Regulations, and also for the volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds that we've already showed you. So if detected, these last 2 bullets, they would be required to remediate to the laboratory practical quantitative limit for these series of compounds in both bullets if the IMAX were deleted. So just providing some background information, and definitely our hazardous waste program that still utilizes this list of remaining IMAX. And if I'm not mistaken, there's 16 total compounds that have not made it fully through this committee onto the commission, as a decision point on whether to delete them as an IMAC, continue to use them as an updated IMAC, or to push them out for public comment, ultimately for adoption into O2L. So as we transition from hazardous waste now onto solid waste, the applicable rules are also in statute. Applicable foundational requirements for assessment remediation start in statute. This program also has the capability for risk-based environmental remediation. Risk-based environmental remediation basically means there are some levels of contaminants that can be left in the environment at a site as long as that is protective of the environment, protective of public health. One of the main things we do if we pursue a risk-based remedy is we no longer allow groundwater to be used as a drinking water source. But we list this statutory provision so that the programs that have the ability to pursue a risk-based environmental closure. They also have extensive rules. These rules have come before the Groundwater and Waste Management Committee as the 15A NCAC 13B solid waste management rules. They are specific to assessment and corrective action at solid waste sites. So assessment is where you're looking for the contaminants, then determining next steps, which ultimately is the corrective action. Do you remove the contaminants? Do you remove the contaminated groundwater? What remedy do you need to implement in order to address that contamination that may exist at the site? And I won't read through all of these, but they're broke out based on the type of landfill, based on specifics of groundwater monitoring, and also the specifics related to our subtitle D, our highest tier, meaning lined landfills, and the references for them in the North Carolina 1600 rules, 1634 and 1635 through 37. So as we talk about landfills, we have to show some of our favorite photos. This is the Sutton landfill in Wilmington, where the coal ash was removed from the associated wet impoundment and placed in an industrial landfill that now you can see has a very nice cap on it. And hopefully we'll be able to store that waste for many years safely, many years to come. All permitted facilities are prioritized equally in the solid waste program. As we've stated, the rules applicable to the different landfills dictate their corrective action and remediation requirements. We always start with that initial focus on off-site receptors, especially those that may be on a private drinking water well supply, and also the off-site migration of contaminants. Do we have contaminants that move more rapidly through the groundwater or soil profile? Are they presenting a risk to surrounding property owners or those that are living adjacent to the facility? And we're looking at potential impacts to those on-site and off-site water supply wells, and also the off-site surface water bodies that may surround these facilities. The compliance action levels for assessment or corrective action at landfills are anchored in the O2L standards. If there's no O2L standard, then we're looking for an interim maximum allowable concentration in groundwater. If there's not that or a fully established standard, then the practical quantitative limit is then referenced. And it is important to note there are rules 0545 and 1634 that can assist in setting a site standard at our landfills. And also the surface water standards, O2B, are referenced for these particular sites. All right, so this list is a little shorter than the haz waste list. You can see we're on the coal ash theme here. This is the industrial landfill up in the Asheville area. the major engineering accomplishment to safely build that landfill based on the topography. As you can see, it looks very different than some landfills. But the list of groundwater, surface water, and leachate constituents required for detection or assessment monitoring at landfills where we found existing IMACs. 5 of the current 16 IMACs we are working with at facilities. You can see the list here. It's not quite as many as in our hazardous waste universe, but the short answer is the solid waste program does still use the IMACs that are in the current 2L rules, and those are listed there for your review. So if the IMACs were eliminated and not moved to the 2L groundwater standard list, permits would then utilize, as we've already stated, the practical quantitative limit for those constituents to determine corrective action and compliance and be required to clean up to that PQL level. There are currently no landfills in corrective action due to exceedances of any of those 16 compounds that are on the IMAC list. However, tetrahydrofuran has an IMAC of 2,000 micrograms per liter. We have found it in groundwater at 30 to 40 unlined landfills. Most of these are C&D facilities, but most of these levels are definitely below that current IMAC level. Of those, as many as 20 to 25 would require assessment and corrective action solely based on that one compound if the interim maximum allowable concentration for groundwater were eliminated. And it is noted here without establishing it in the 2L groundwater rules. And at least 3 other unlined landfills have reported detections of either the dibromomethane, vinyl acetate, or dibenzoxyfuran at levels well below an IMAC and also below PQL. So just trying to give you some background on how these compounds are used as we dovetail it with an overview of our assessment and corrective action work. So as we transition to Superfund, I won't read through all of these, but as you've heard from our last presentation, Superfund covers several distinct programs from North Carolina's dry cleaning program, pre-regulatory landfill program, our inactive hazardous sites program, and our federal facilities program. So there's definitely a lot of statutory and rule references when it comes to assessment and cleanup or corrective action work in Superfund. So I won't read through all of these, but just want to give you the applicable references, whether we're talking about inactive hazardous sites, our special remediation group, which is the dry cleaning and pre-regulatory landfill program, or our federal facilities group that works with a lot of the military installations, but also oversees North Carolina's national priority list sites. So when we talk about prioritization for Superfund, this is the program that has a lot of specifics on site prioritization. The general statute 130A 310.2 does require the development of a system to prioritize these inactive hazardous substance or waste disposal sites. There's several thousand of these in North Carolina, so we do have to prioritize our work on them and make sure those that present the most risk to public health or the environment are the ones that we're focused on. We do have a limited budget on this front, so providing this risk ranking as required in the O200 rules is really key. And this risk ranking system looks at the ability of contaminated groundwater to move off site, the impacts potentially to surface water and other receptors that all plugs into a ranking system so that we can keep our focus on the highest priority sites. And staff oversee these remedial actions of voluntary parties, which often occurs in our registered environmental consultant program, where they conduct them work, and we work on the higher risk or orphan sites where there is no identified responsible party based on the availability of state funding that we have. And as I mentioned, we do have our other programs from dry cleaning and our federal facilities that are also looking at what sites we're prioritizing, whether they're naturally on the federal list, which is the national priority list, or sites that are presenting the most imminent risk to public health and the environment. So there is several compounds here on the list of remaining IMACs. Like I said, I believe there's 16 compounds that this committee is continuing to evaluate that we do use as the Division of Waste Management in the Superfund program. These are IMAX that are known to be contaminants at multiple federal sites and are inactive hazardous sites, which is often the program where there's not a viable responsible party. So it gives you a little background on the use of those compounds as we evaluate what needs to be assessed and then ultimately what levels the site needs to be cleaned up to. And this is one of our favorite pictures. It is a National Priority List site. We may have showed it last time, the Ore Knob copper mine in Ashe County, where a lot of that mining activity and processing of that ore, led to an environment where very little grows, and obviously a significant amount of mining tailings. The EPA helped us with a significant remedy to prevent those tailings from reaching surface water, ultimately impacting trout-sensitive waters in that area. But contaminants in groundwater must be delineated to the respective 2L groundwater standard. If there are no site-specific cleanup levels, 2L standards or IMAX are available, then the remediating parties, just as we've stated for our other programs, would clean up to that PQL as referenced in the rules, that practical quantitative limit that laboratories can achieve. All right, we wrap up with our final two programs. UST is next. We have several different sets of regulations applicable to site remediation for underground storage tanks. We have the general statute references to the Oil Pollution and Hazardous Substance Control Act. We also have the ability for these sites to also pursue a risk-based remediation component. It's a separate reference than the other risk-based programs in the division, but they can address certain levels of contaminants that are allowed to remain on site as long as specific criteria are met. The specific 0400 and 0500 sections of the 2L rules do address the risk-based assessment and corrective actions specifically for petroleum underground storage tanks and from releases for above ground tanks. And then we do have a separate rule reference that is applicable to our soil remediation sites where contaminated soil is taken to be bioremediated in order to properly manage that material. So the methods for site prioritization, they're based on levels of high, medium, and low risk as defined in the 2L rules 0406 and 0506 for non-UST sites. We're looking at proximity to water supply wells, proximity to other sensitive receptors as the rules require us to do in order to derive that risk ranking. The high and intermediate risk incidents must conduct assessment and remedial activities. And you can see those remedial activities, whether it's an air sparge system, removing particular receptors like a private well that's in close proximity, removing hot spots of contaminated soil, or more active remedial options like direct injections of different chemicals or dual phase extraction. If it's determined to be a low risk incident where that petroleum release is not endangering receptors or there's a very low risk to any receptors, they may be closed based on the statutory references you see in the last bullet here with a notice of residual petroleum, noting that some petroleum remains at this site. It was not fully cleaned up, but it does not present an intermediate or high risk. They are closed. You can also have closure that includes restrictions when they have the soil to groundwater or residential groundwater maximum soil contaminant concentrations, which is another reference for us, whichever one is lower and groundwater less than the O2L standard. So UST has some very specific cleanup targets and different rule references based on the different type of contaminant, meaning petroleum and petroleum associated constituents, and how they behave in the environment, meaning they often don't go great distances from where they're released. Like some other contaminants in the environment will move very quickly through soil, very quickly through groundwater, go straight to bedrock. Petroleum behaves a little differently, and there's specific rules, for these particular sites and the assessment of them. So we do have some sites where the remaining IMAX are utilized, and the active underground storage tank facilities use these IMAX standards to determine if the detected constituent is a chemical of concern and requires cleanup based on the associated risk classification. A lot of these are what we call fuel oxygenates. They help with the combustion of fuel, but they can be found at underground storage tank sites, and they're required to be analyzed if they are at an active UST site. And so you can see the 4 here that we've referenced. The release of the compounds can indicate that a new release has occurred from an active system at sites, where an old release may also be present. And the ones that are listed above, except for ETBE, have been detected in groundwater at greater than 100 sites across the state. ETBE has been detected in groundwater a little less than 50 sites across the state. So another program to share with you with specific cleanup and assessment criteria, but also the particular references to the IMAC list that they're currently utilizing. So if the IMACs were eliminated, in accordance with the O2L rules, groundwater contamination at high-risk sites will be cleaned up to the O2L standard or the IMAC. In accordance with 047D, at intermediate risk sites, they must be cleaned up to gross contaminant levels. GCLs are calculated specifically at 50% of the solubility of the contaminant at a specific temperature point, or 1,000 times the groundwater standard or interim standard established in rule. So GCLs, or gross contaminant levels, these are specific and unique to the UST program based on the type of contamination encountered at these sites. The rule allows the use of these gross contaminant levels, but it's not really applicable to our other cleanup programs. But if the IMACs are eliminated, the groundwater must be remediated, once again, to that practical quantitative limit at the high-risk sites where petroleum's been released. All right, our last program to share with you this morning is the Brownfields Redevelopment Section. You met Bruce Nicholson, the section chief of it, utilizing the regulations applicable to making sites safe for reuse. They're anchored in General Statute 130A, Article 9, under the Brownfields Property Reuse Act, which allows DEQ to enter into brownfield agreements with prospective developers, facilitate that safe redevelopment of contaminated, abandoned, or properties that are underutilized. There's not specific rules, as we've mentioned. There's not administrative code that accompanies this program, just the general statute references regarding the Property Reuse Act. We have been working diligently on taking contaminated property and allowing it to be redeveloped or since recycled, but also making sure public health is addressed through proper risk assessment. Naturally, if there's impacted groundwater or impacted soil, we're cutting off those exposure pathways based on the redevelopment option so that people are not in proximity to any of these contaminants that may remain at a site. And we're over now 700 agreements in North Carolina, which is a major achievement, and over $25 billion in private investment into this specific program. When we talk about making the site safe and IMACs, they're really utilized very sparingly in brownfields. When we went through the database, any change to the current IMACs would have limited impact to this program. How they're making sites safe is really determined on calculated risk levels for media and routes of exposure, as I gave you that example. If groundwater is contaminated, the agreement is going to cut off the ability to ever use groundwater as a drinking water source. If soil is contaminated, it's going to require that soil to be removed, covered with an impervious surface, or a prohibition on digging, planting at a specific depth so those contaminants are not encountered. And no properties where contaminants from the IMAC list, no sites were discovered where they are a significant risk driver. And these limited impacts include the potential for vapor intrusion for those contaminants on the list that are volatile and can migrate into salt gas. But it would be a small fraction of sites that we have that concern about. So just a few closing points here, just giving you really the 100,000-foot overview and the foundational rules and statutory references for our work on site assessment, remediation, and the Division of Waste Management. It's very diverse work, from working on the corner gas station to the worst of the worst federal NPL National Priorities List site. And as we tie it back to the IMACs, if the IMACs were removed, meaning not readopted as IMACs or not put out to public comment for this committee and commission's consideration, the cleanup standard at multiple sites, as you've seen in this slide deck, would then default back to the practical quantitative limit. What that means is a lower value would then have to be achieved. And that's for this committee and the commission's ultimate decision point, based on the O2L, O2, O2C rules. Multiple DWM sites might be required to begin assessment and corrective action if those IMACs went away, or if they were not readopted or put into the full code. And we may lose a level of protection following environmental site assessments during property transactions, not having those target values handy. So we recommend further discussion and review of the data before making decisions, regarding the next steps on these 16 remaining compounds. We do have a list of 2 compounds that we could not find in our data set out of the 16. And so we'll be glad to further that discussion, Chair Bailey and others, at the appropriate time. But appreciate this opportunity to provide a brief overview of assessment and remediation across our 5 programs. And we've got almost all the team here. So if we want to dive deep, we'll be glad to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I welcome any questions now. I mean, this is a wonderful opportunity to be able to dive deep with the staff here to answer questions. These are complicated programs, and these are the programs that we don't hear much about because mostly we're rulemaking or we're looking at penalty assessments. So it's been a pleasure to hear about all the different things your division is doing. And also I like your summary slide. That was a good summary of it can prolong cleanup at sites and prolong monitoring. And then it also triggers corrective action in some sites. So these IMACs play a big part of the cleanup efforts. Does anybody, I'm opening it for questions. Commissioner Weiss?
I was hoping you could say a little bit more about all sites are prioritized equally. I think you mentioned that with regard to solid waste and hazardous waste. And then with Superfund and UST, it's a risk ranking. Am I understanding that?
You got that right. Yeah. Adam, you want to participate on the first hazardous waste ranking that ranked all equally? You want to pitch in on that? Come on up. Yeah. But you are correct. They differ as programs. Hazardous waste and solid waste rank them equally. So Adam will speak to hazardous waste and I can speak to solid waste or Ed will. Go ahead, Adam. Introduce yourself.
Adam Ulishny, hazardous waste section. Nice to meet everyone. To your question, and it comes down to, at least for hazardous waste, is the number of sites in the universe. So our universe is a lot smaller than, say, Superfund or UST. We only have about 86 permitted sites that are doing corrective action or assessment.
And if you have 86 sites and there's
They are being actively managed by a project manager. So if someone is actively working on them, they are assigned to a specific person to work on. So each site has its own specific project manager. There's not a site that's not being worked on.
okay. And are there, depending on the site, different like milestones they have to reach to move out, but that to move into compliance, or how's that addressed?
Each site is addressed. While they're different, they're still required to do assessment and corrective action to 2L standard or 2B standard.
Thank you very much.
Could I expand on that a little bit? Because I mean, I have worked with Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA Part B permits, but they were, and so it's a permitted facility under the federal program. And so what I recall, which has been a while, is just that these are ongoing facilities. These are active companies is what I've seen a lot of. And maybe I'm saying this wrong, so you're here to correct me. But these are companies that are in business and they have hazardous waste on their sites. And they're required to go around their entire site once something is found to find other areas of concern. It's different than a Superfund site where it's contamination that might have been discovered during like a property assessment. Somebody wants to buy the property, or it's a old landfill that was reported. So am I getting that right about the RCRA facilities are kind of a different one because they're permitted through a federal permitting program?
Yes, you are correct. I mean, they're large sites. They have permits to operate either, they generate hazardous waste, so they either store, or treat hazardous waste. Those do not store, treat, are permitted because they had some type of disposal and or release at the facility. But they are large sites that could have anywhere between 20 and 40 different areas of concern that they're addressing at any time.
And the ones I was working with were manufacturing sites that have been there for a long time. So that seems more unique than, I mean, that seems like a different kind of cleanup, say, than Superfund or inactive sites, anyway. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Maybe I'll ask Janet. Janet, you want to speak to inactive hazardous sites, kind of the difference? Adam was touching on kind of the limited universe, hazardous waste, solid waste, and then kind of the broader universe, UST, inactive hazardous sites, meaning greater numbers of sites, and how risk prioritization is so key. Probably the best example is inactive hazardous sites. If you want to speak to that need for risk prioritization and how we approach it.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Janet McDonald, head of the Inactive Hazardous Sites branch. And we, by rule, have a protocol for ranking our sites. We have a plethora of sites. Some have known responsible parties, some don't. Some we have a lot of information on, some we have very limited information on. And we are getting new sites all the time, often through brownfield properties and just citizens or, parties letting us know. So we do have a system that we need to keep track of. It's based on a CERCLA methodology, and it includes the risk drivers, water supply wells, residences on properties, rainfall. There's a very detailed protocol, but we also have just an internal big picture overview where we're looking at the major receptors. So we are constantly trying to categorize and put some order to what we have in our inventory. But we have over 2,000 sites that are open, that are being addressed, that we are trying to stay on top of. So.
And I just wanted to add for everybody, you used the word CERCLA, which is a federal acronym commonly known as Superfund. But it's, so just to be clear, I think you're saying, a lot of how Superfund sites are ranked are what we're doing with our state inactive sites that don't rise to the level of being eligible under the Superfund Act. Is that about right?
Yes, that's correct.
Are there other questions about the Commissioner Carter?
Yeah, Michael, let me, this is sort of more of a conceptual question. I'm going back to your slide on Superfund cleanups. Excuse me, I'm not Superfund, brownfield cleanups. And it specifically, I think, mentions that you don't use IMAX there, you use a risk-based approach, which I think is great. Sites I've worked on, I think it's worked very well. But it sort of raised the question, I got to thinking, all right, but for other types of contaminated sites, why not use a similar risk-based approach instead of using IMAX? Is there some fundamental reason why we have two different approaches for different kinds of contaminated sites?
All right. Now I'll ask Bruce to pitch in here. It's a team effort, but I'll start the answer. Brownfields, as you know, in statute, Commissioner Carter, is specifically to look at redevelopment of a program.
Right.
They're not per se a cleanup program. And so you're dealing with an entity who is not responsible for the contamination. You're trying to approach it with a risk-based approach that facilitates the redevelopment. Otherwise, you're asking a new entity, the prospective developer, to incur all of the associated cost with site cleanup, which would often be prohibitive to the actual redevelopment of the property. So the act allows the approach in order to facilitate that redevelopment, which if we told someone they had to clean up the site fully, it could prohibit that action actually moving forward. So Bruce, you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's what Michael is saying is largely why the Brownfields Act was passed, and that is there was a large number of these sites that had these contaminants on them that were sort of collecting up in an elephant's graveyard, and nobody wanted to touch them because of potential environmental liability associated with that. In the construct that before brownfields, mere ownership of these properties would mean you would have to clean them up to these standards. So where there's a responsible party, that's not the case in the other programs. They would have to clean them up to the 2L standard or other standards that are applicable. In brownfields, what we're doing is working with the prospective developer. And the first thing is the prospective developer who's eligible for brownfield agreement cannot have caused or contributed to the contamination in any way. So in that regard, brownfields really preserves the polluter pays principle as associated with all of the other cleanup programs. We work only with entities who did not cause or contribute, and therefore are able to do so and have them work on the site and make the site safe for the reuse they propose, not necessarily remediate it to the environmental standards that are within the construct of the other programs. This allows a different type of approach, a flexible approach, one which is cost effective for brownfields, but still maintains public health protections for the use of those properties. And it has done wonders for the reuse of properties and investment in these properties, whereas before, as I said, there were sort of elephant graveyards of abandonment. There are now a lot of redevelopment that's taking place. And this is happening, you know, certainly in many urban areas, but not just there, but in rural areas as well, where there's a strong history of rural manufacturing, and somebody wants to reuse some of these old textile mills for another purpose. That's just an example, but there are many out there. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I'm glad to try to.
Well, as I said, I'm fully in favor of how y'all approach it under Superfund. My question really has to do with the other sites. For example, I'm thinking about the sites where we may not have a responsible party and so on, and yet somebody at that point is being pushed to clean up to, say, a 2L or whatever. Instead of using a risk-based approach there, my question really is, why not use a similar risk-based approach for those other types of sites? I think it's worked very well in brownfields, and we've been able to put these properties back into use. But it seems like if you have a very hard-edged 2L or IMAC approach, you may be putting yourself in a position where you're not going to get those sites really cleaned up and able to be reused, because you're setting, well, not you, but the system is setting a target, a goal for cleanup it's really not achievable in some cases, not necessarily in all, but at least in some cases. That's the side of it, the question I'm sort of tussling with here.
Right, and I think maybe part of the answer to your question, as we referenced in these slides, there are certain programs right here: inactive hazardous sites, risk-based environmental remediation of sites, the statutory reference, Commissioner Carter. So certain programs are allowed to use a risk-based approach. I think that's part of the answer to your question here.
So basically the statute, and in effect, the statute forces the other approach. I had a suspicion that was the answer. I just wanted to make sure.
So there are programs by statute that are not allowed to pursue a risk-based remedy, and they are spelled out. The programs that are allowed are also spelled out. So that, I think, is really the start of the answer to your question. Where it's allowed by statute, risk-based remedies can be pursued, but those remedies are also dependent on specific criteria. Off-site contamination is a big one. Off-site groundwater migration, off-site impact to surface waters can be a deal breaker by statute, meaning you can't pursue a risk-based remedy. But I think as you look at these references to GS 138, Article 9, Part A, you'll see the respective programs that are allowed to pursue that. But yeah, great question.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Chair Smith, you had some questions from last time.
So one follow-up to Commissioner Carter's questions. So there is a general risk-based remediation statute in the state already, and then there are other specific programs like UST that are built around a risk-based model. So one question is, do you have a feel for what percentage of sites are actually being remediated to a groundwater standard or an IMAC versus the number of sites that are being remediated under a risk-based approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a percentage right offhand, I know that, and you're aware of this, Chair Smith, but you know, the applicability of the risk-based approach got broadened to haz waste, solid waste. So that universe has grown, kind of Commissioner Carter's question, from what it previously was. And so short answer, I don't have that percentage. We can double back with our sites and data and tease that out and maybe come back to the committee with that. The short answer is there's a lot of programs that have that capability of a risk-based approach. But once again, you cannot be impacting, as you know, Chair Smith, off-site properties, off-site surface water. So there's criteria that dictate where that's applicable. But when you talk about the number of sites in UST, the number of sites in Superfund, a lot of these sites are able to incorporate a risk-based approach. So I think you're going to see the percentages higher with that approach than the full 2L cleanup, but I don't have an exact number.
That is my sense as well, that it's a significant percentage of sites one way or the other. But to follow up, if I could, on the question about prioritization, I was curious both within something like the inactive hazardous sites program, where because of the number of sites and the statutory requirement that we prioritize as a way of allocating resources to oversee remediation, do you have a sense of whether we are looking adequately at the cumulative effects of multiple sites within a geographic area? And that may mean multiple inactive hazardous waste sites, or it may mean a combination of sites across different programs. So one thing we have, based on the statutes and rules right now, is a little bit of a silo where we have a UST program for petroleum underground storage tanks. We have inactive hazardous sites that may handle a broad variety of hazardous substance contamination. Do we have a good way to look either within these programs or across these programs to understand what the cumulative effects might be on a community of multiple sites?
Yeah, I would say the start to that answer, we have a tremendous resource in our waste management site locator tool. So every site with known contamination or perceived environmental contamination is on an interactive map that all of our colleagues utilize. So when we're looking at a site, we can quickly see the UST incident next door, what the number is, pull that associated file. Speaking to your point on cumulative impact, that is an area we're looking more and more at as we also look at factors like environmental justice. But we do have tools now that we didn't have 5-7 years ago to look at that cumulative impact of environmental contamination in a specific area. How it's factoring into our site prioritization, you know, that's kind of a different discussion, but I do feel like we are much better equipped with the resources to look at total impact to a community versus just the silo reference or one program. Does it have all the data across DEQ? I would say not yet, but within waste management, we're able to look, like I said, UST incidents, Superfund site, and really helps brownfields as they evaluate a property to know what's the environmental contamination in the area and more specifically at that site. So great question. I wouldn't say we're fully at it but there yet on cumulative impact, but it's an active point of discussion and we have more resources than we did just 5 years ago.
One quick follow-up on that is, I think you're certainly right. We have better tools in terms of data and understanding where sites are, mapping capabilities. And so one question I'd be interested in going forward, so I know there's not an answer to this today, is whether we have the right regulatory tools in place. So we have a lot of rules, we have some statutes and rules that drive the prioritization process, for example, for some of these cleanups. And we have rules that drive selection of the remediation, plan. So one question going forward might be, do we have rules in place that allow us to take the interaction between different sites or different types of contaminated sites into account when we're making those decisions about either prioritization or about what the remediation plan should look like, what the remedy should be?
Yeah, great point, great feedback. I totally agree with the reference you're making and how we dovetail all the information not just information from one program into that site prioritization. So how do we take that site locator tool that I referenced, all the data that it's pulling from, and factor that into the prioritization? But yeah, great point, and something for us to definitely further the discussion on.
So is that what you would like for Christmas?
I don't need much for Christmas. It's all about the kids, but that would be good on the work item list. Let's say that. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Mary and Commissioner Deerhake?
Thank you for letting me visit this meeting. And a question, it's been 35, 40 years now since the heart of the hazardous waste standards were promulgated, or regulations were promulgated federally. And I know we don't have any commercial landfills in the state. We haven't for decades. But maybe there are still some private hazardous waste landfills that have closed. So now we are in this time frame where we are beyond probably a 30-year post-closure monitoring status for some of these permitted closed landfills, hazardous waste landfills. Has that occurred? Do we have any closed landfills that are beyond monitoring programs now?
Yeah, the post-closure discussions that we're having are more related to solid waste, and Ed Musler can chime in. I don't know that the haz waste landfills, I'll look at Adam. I'm not sure, do you want to speak to that point? Or I've not been in those discussions recently on any haz waste landfills beyond the 30-year post-closure. It's an active discussion, though, regarding what we do with a facility after they complete their 3 decades after they close of monitoring. What's the next step? Is there a next step? And so I would say it's an active discussion across our division. It's been a lot of the focus has been on the solid waste front and all of those non-haz waste sites that are making their way through that 3-decade process. So we're looking closely at that, what data we may need to make final decisions on whether they are actually done with post-closure care. And the same would be applicable to the haz waste facilities that you're referencing. And if it's not at a steady state that's protective of the environment and public health, then we're going to pull from the relevant statutes and rules to take that next step after those 3 decades of post-closure care. The goal is to provide that monitoring, as you know, for quite an extended time frame to make sure it's at a steady state and that contamination is not moving, it's not presenting a risk if there is contamination that exists. So it's an active discussion. It's not a full answer to your question, but I think a lot of states are working through this process of as our programs get older and sites get older, where we're going to be at after post-closure care.
1980, I don't think I would have ever imagined myself asking this question in
No, I know.
2023.
I think that's a great question, because I worked on records of decision, and it's like, once this is done, we have the 30-year monitoring. And then that was decades ago, just thinking about the 30-year monitoring, but then actually closing it out when none of the contaminants have left the site. Are you going to be abandoning monitoring wells? That seems scary, actually, because then you wouldn't have a way to track what's going on afterwards. Other than you've seen stability for a certain amount of time. So you would, I guess, be able to presume it's not going to get worse. But anyway, yeah, that was a good question. Are there any other questions?
I just have one maybe comment.
Commissioner Keene?
Commissioner Scott, it's interesting that when these combustible waste sites, they, at first sight, you see the smoke in the air and it's air quality. But putting the fire out, a lot of water is used. And those create the amount of water to put the fire out, as we've seen in Wake County with a recent incident, and also in Wayne County with the water that it takes 3 and 4 days to put out these fires. So assessing that for the future in sites that are combustible, that will need a lot of water to put the fire out. Then as we set silt fencing for construction sites to protect blue lines, streams, so forth during construction, then what about the prioritizing of sites that are in the future may, I guess, may damage streams or blue lines close to the site, or if water is groundwater or becomes the surface water and then groundwater moving, then mapping, prioritizing, as we have been discussing here shortly. Is that on the books with IMAX? Is that a concern that we need to think about moving forward when we look at cleanup and oversight and what chemicals were released from putting that fire out that goes into those streams, that goes into those blue lines? If those waste sites are close in a mapping way in an area, whether it's maybe wetlands, or, I mean, do we have foresight into looking at that as we move forward when we're discussing IMAX concerns?
I think that's a great question. You know, the IMAX are specific to groundwater levels, the O2L rules. You know, we have followed up. Bill's here with us, who's followed up on the Dudley fire. You may be referencing it. That was more recent than the land clearing debris fire here in Raleigh that I believe you spoke about at the last commission meeting. We respond as a department, our division, also Division of Water Resources, to sample surface waters if we think they've been impacted or we know there's been a release to them. I think the fire at Dudley, the local decision of Wayne County was not to use an abundance of water for the reason you're talking about, not to have high volumes of firefighting water run off the site, but to try to do more of a controlled burn. And so we do follow up on these sites. I think the IMAX are applicable in these scenarios where there are materials that are stored that may be burned, and then we're sampling groundwater. Hence, this would be the Weaver fertilizer site where we are looking at an environmental assessment with them and their consultant post-fire. But on the surface water side, we are collaborating with water resources at these large fires to sample where we feel there could be a risk of surface water impacts. You know, to your point on how we characterize them or look at them, some of these sites don't have permits. They may be a junkyard, which junkyards aren't permitted, at least by our division. And when they do catch on fire, we may respond for certain environmental impacts, but we're not necessarily categorizing them across the state. So I think you make a good point, meaning the risk of these sites and their proximity to rivers, streams, and other receptors. But my point would be the department does respond. We do collect data to make sure those receptors are monitored. But in some of these instances, the sites don't carry permits based on their business operation, if you will. And so we don't have quite the regulatory hook that we do with some programs where they are required to have a permit.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair Smith?
So one question about IMAX in particular and the potential impact on cleanups if an IMAC is not adopted as a rule, if it's repealed or allowed to expire without being adopted as a rule. Have we gotten any legal advice? And it is my duty to create new work for Mr. Reynolds, if it is possible. But do we have we gotten any legal advice on whether that would in fact have a retroactive effect on plans, remediation plans that have already been approved or not? It seems like that's a little bit of an open question. The way the IMAC rule is written, I would assume if you're the first party who comes in because you have a site to clean up and you ask for an IMAC under the process and the division approves the IMAC specifically for that remediation plan, I would guess that a later rule change would not affect that plan approval under the IMAC for that particular project. Then you got the next category of cleanups where people follow along behind that initial requester, and they have cleanups that are being authorized under an IMAC that was approved originally for a different
Right.
site. And then you've got the future ones. So it seems like as we continue through this process and think about whether we want to or need to adopt the remaining IMACs as rules or not, we may need to get a better feel for exactly what that impact would be and whether there would be a retroactive effect on remediation plans that have already been approved under an IMAC or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah, very good point. Yep.
Yeah,
Since it's almost in the sense of a grandfather clause, or you've already started your remediation, we've looked at it trying to be all encompassing, that if the number went away, here's what could happen if that rule reference doesn't specifically provide that. But yes, good point. We'll take that back to our legal team to look closer at that so that we know these, potential effects if an IMAC went away. And I think there's only 2 on the list, the picromac acid and 1,2-dichloroethylene, that we really could not find in our database. The other 14 we're seeing somewhere across the world of waste management. But yeah, great point on plans that are already approved at a target value, meaning the IMAC, and if something changed, what would be the expectation? And I think we would get that very quickly in public comment and other areas too. Yeah.
just to follow up on that, I mean, we've had conversations about, or I've been in conversations about just breaking the IMAC rule out of the 2L standard, because it's sort of in the introductory section, and have it be its own section, if that's the right word. And maybe that's something I certainly wanted to look at, the pros and cons of doing that, as part of making a decision about these 16 IMACs that are out there right now. Some of these questions we're asking might need to be addressed in a breakout rule. So it's not a part of the standards. It's just a separate section that we're looking at, because IMACs are not the standard. So why is it in the standards?
Yeah. If I could, just real quickly, as you know, Mike DeMar we had the watershed issue piece. And again, mapping, it'd be interesting to see the prioritization in these waste sites, in these watershed areas, throughout the state. If we're going to zero in on watershed, what we can and can't do, then waste management, what are the waste principles within the watershed areas? If we're going to ID and break watershed out,
Okay.
then if we've got those prioritization, does that make sense?
It does, yeah. As you're evaluating a specific watershed, our databases and GIS framework, should allow us to pull information regarding that watershed and key, I would say, high-risk sites that we're working on in that watershed. So that's great feedback. It's something that I think we can definitely pull from, and we'll take that comment back. We may not have a comprehensive list tomorrow, but we can take that back and look at it for sure. I don't know that we've done that recently by watershed per se, but we can break it out.
I read that, and with those comments today, Madam Chair, it just, I don't know, epiphany.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any more on this information item? Commissioner Deerhake?
Thank you. One question did come to mind that I corresponded with Chair Smith about, but it was triggered by Commissioner Keene asking about the Wayne County fire. And this was a site that had stored a lot of treated lumber, is that right?
Railroad ties.
Railroad ties. So it jogged in my mind that pentachlorophenol is a RCRA-listed waste, but these were wood products. Was there a treatment? Has DAQ had a conversation with you about the pentachlorophenol?
Yeah, I've not been in a direct conversation with DAQ about that. What I can tell you is we have coordinated with EPA, Wayne County, and across all of DEQ on what follow-up, is needed for the Dudley site. We're not a stranger to old cross ties, railroad ties, and what can be within them. So I would say there's further discussions on next steps and what may be applicable here, but it's all divisions. So I'm partly answering your question, but more to come on that front. We have facilities that do take cross ties, some that burn cross ties. So we're familiar with cross tie management and what's in them. And here it was an unfortunate fire. Like I said, we had heard that the decision was not to put a lot of water on it, let it burn out. But then obviously, like at Weaver, there's follow-up on what other data and information is needed post-fire to make sure the community's safe. But yeah, thank you for the question, and we've been talking about it.
Was that simply a storage site, or were they doing wood treatment there too?
I don't know that they were doing any wood treatment. Bill's been involved.
I visited the site.
Introduce yourself.
Bill Haneke with the Superfund section. I was at the site last week. They had 1.8 million railroad ties at the site the day of the fire. Their business model is they take, and CSX, who they're in cahoots with, I don't know if they buy these things or if they just get them for a really good price, but CSX decommissions 2.5 million a year railroad ties. They have a lifespan of 20 to 30 years. They get a boatload of ties in, and their model is they call the best ones out, they sell them to the Home Depots and the Lowe's of the world as landscaping ties. That's their money. The rest of them get chipped up into little bits and used for energy recovery. That's about a break-even proposition there, and it's probably about a 80-20. They probably get, if they get 20% called out to sell as landscaping ties, they call that good. So the last piece of this is they're going to take a magnetometer and collect, or not a magnet, and collect what they say 20,000 tons. I think it was about 8 million pounds of metal. Each railroad tie's got plates on them, metal plates that weigh about 2.5 pounds each. So there's a good bit of metal recovery in that operation as well. But long story short, to answer your question, is their model is it should be ties in, ties out. For some reason, they've just accumulated these ties over years. I spoke to a lady at length who lives across the street and has had air quality issues with the site for years, and was told in 2021 they'd give me a year and we'll be back to equal and we'll have ties in, ties out. Well, that hasn't come true yet. So we'll see what happens. Right now, to answer your question about air quality, I've spoken to the air quality folks at the Washington Regional Office who've addressed numerous complaints over the years, but once during the fire, there was no Wayne County said, we got this. DAQ and EPA both reached out on that Saturday to Wayne County, said, can we provide perimeter air monitoring? What can we do? Can we provide booms so that the water doesn't go into the Neuse River, which is 1/2 mile away? We got this. That's fine. As soon as the ash lays on the ground, DEQ's out. So we're coming in now behind, and Water Resources, DWR, said they didn't put enough water on the site for us to worry about it. Anything that went in is down in the Neuse River, and we're done. They never went out. Stormwater was there. I was on the stormwater inspection. They're very concerned and vigilant about what leaves the property going forward. But at this point, they've taken the ash. First they're going to collect the metal. Then they're going to scoop the ash up. They've identified a landfill in Wayne County, 6 miles away, who's actually going to take the ash based on analytical data that was retrieved from another fire that this facility or this company had in Alabama that was unfortunately a lightning strike that burned some of that. So they feel like that characterization is fine. We're not good with that. We're getting 5 samples of about 32 acres burned of these 1.8 million railroad ties. So we're going to characterize the ash. We're asking for soil samples. We're asking for, I think, 3 at minimum monitoring wells. So that letter's going out tomorrow to the company. They've been very proactive and very, very easy to deal with at this point.
A lot more to come.
And more than you probably wanted to know.
Before you step back, Two questions, I guess. First is, you mentioned air quality. What's the nature? Is it particulate coming off the grinding process or?
Just dust, just old railroad ties, just kind of shedding like a dog. And there's not, the grinding process, yeah, absolutely too.
Right.
So that's, it's mostly, I think it's a combination of both.
And I guess the second, and I don't know if you know the answer to this, do we know what started this fire? Was it spontaneous combustion, a lightning strike?
Yeah, arson, they think it's arson.
Oh,
Yeah. So there was accelerant found in the corner of the property. This is a Saturday night at 1:00 in the morning, day before the Super Bowl. And they also identified 2 other sites within a mile or so of that area that were also accelerant. They don't think it was anything nefarious in terms of action against the company or grudges or anything like that. They think it was knuckleheads, basically, that just were out for and at that point, the interesting fact that everybody's been there to the site to ensure, federal insurance and commissioners and folks and arson inspectors. First question was, is your facility insured? The answer was, our buildings and equipment are insured. The 1.8 million railroad ties that burned were not. And the insurance commissioner said, I have no more questions. So they don't think they did it. It's not insurance fraud. It's just unfortunate.
Well, more follow-up to come. Thank you, Bill.
you got knuckleheads in Wayne County?
Knuckleheads are everywhere.
Well, thank you, Director Scott. That was excellent. It's everything we wanted to have covered on this topic in our continuing series of finding out more about groundwater and waste management activities at the staff level that normally we don't get to hear that much about. It's pretty interesting what they have to do with these cleanups and how complicated they are. The next thing is upcoming items. You'll see that we're going to have an item on the agenda tomorrow that we've had before us in our committees. And then there's another section on future committee meetings. And so far, they're just predicting information items. And again, I encourage anybody on this committee, if they want to get more detail about the programs or want to add in something to the upcoming committee agenda, please let me know and we can work with staff to put it together for you. I mean, we've already made notes and seen what some people are interested in. So I think these are great overviews that we've got coming up. The next item is director's remarks. Director Scott is listed first. Do you have anything more to add?
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
And then Director Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not much to add. We look forward to coming before the committee to talk about our groundwater sampling. If you have any specific areas of focus, we'll be glad to take those from you and focus our efforts there. I would like to make an announcement. The Division of Water Resources, we've hired a new deputy director. No stranger to you, but he is in a new role, and I just wanted to ask Michael Projetra to stand up and welcome him in as our deputy director.
Congratulations.
Director, Division of Water Resources. Thank you.
Congratulations. Thank you. And I have no closing remarks. I just welcome any of your comments. Feel free to email me. And the meeting is adjourned. I found out I have a gavel. But